For decades, Americans who wanted to buy or own a firearm suppressor, also known as a silencer, faced one of the strictest regulatory regimes in federal law. But today, the Supreme Court's conservative majority says parts of that regime are unconstitutional. This decision could reshape the Second Amendment debate nationwide. At the heart of this ruling is a fundamental constitutional question. Does the Second Amendment's protection of the right to keep and bear arms extend beyond firearms themselves to include accessories like suppressors? In a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court's majority concluded that it does. The court determined that suppressors, when attached to firearms that are lawfully owned, fall within the broader scope of protected arms because they are in common use for lawful purposes. That interpretation significantly narrows the federal government's authority to impose sweeping bans or unusually burdensome restrictions on their purchase and possession. The majority relied heavily on the court's modern Second Amendment framework, which requires that firearm regulations be consistent with the nation's historical tradition of gun regulation. Under this test, the government must demonstrate that a modern law has a clear historical analog from the founding era or early American history. In this case, the majority found insufficient historical evidence showing that suppressor-like devices were broadly prohibited or treated as uniquely dangerous in a way that would justify categorical bans today. Importantly, the ruling does not eliminate all regulation. The court did not say suppressors are beyond government oversight entirely. Instead, it held that regulations must align with historical practices and cannot impose restrictions so severe that they effectively function as a prohibition. In practical terms, this means federal rules that treated suppressors as exceptionally restricted items may now be unconstitutional if they cannot be justified under the historical standard. The decision signals a continued expansion of Second Amendment protections beyond just firearms themselves and underscores the court's willingness to scrutinize long-standing gun control measures under its history-focused approach. To understand why this ruling matters, it's critical to see how it fits into the Supreme Court's broader Second Amendment trajectory over the past several years. The foundation for this decision lies in the court's 2022 ruling in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, which dramatically changed how courts evaluate gun laws. In Bruin, the court rejected the long-used balancing test approach that allowed judges to weigh public safety concerns against gun rights. Instead, the majority established a history and tradition standard. If a modern firearm regulation is challenged, the government must prove that it is consistent with America's historical tradition of firearm regulation, particularly around the time of the founding. That shift has had sweeping consequences. Since Bruin, lower courts have been required to look backward, sometimes to the 18th or 19th century, to determine whether modern laws have historical analogs. If lawmakers cannot point to comparable restrictions from that era, the regulation is vulnerable to being struck down. This framework has already influenced cases involving concealed carry laws, firearm possession restrictions, and regulatory definitions of firearms and components. In this suppressor decision, the court applied the same methodology. Rather than asking whether suppressor restrictions serve public safety or reduce crime, the majority focused on whether similar accessories were historically banned or heavily regulated. Finding little evidence of such tradition, the court concluded that modern, stringent suppressor regulations do not align with the constitutional standards set in Bruin. In short, this ruling is not an isolated development. It represents another step in the court's ongoing effort to reinterpret the Second Amendment through a strict historical lens, a shift that continues to reshape the legal landscape for gun regulation nationwide. A firearm suppressor, sometimes called a silencer, is a cylindrical device that attaches to the muzzle of a gun. Its primary function is to reduce the sound, flash, and concussion produced when a firearm is discharged. Contrary to popular portrayals in movies, suppressors do not make gunshots completely silent. Instead, they lower the noise level to reduce hearing damage and minimize disturbance. Many gun owners argue they are safety devices, similar to mufflers on cars, because they help protect hearing and reduce recoil and muzzle blast. Despite this, suppressors have long been regulated under the National Firearms Act, a federal law enacted in 1934 during an era of heightened concern over organized crime. Under that framework, purchasing a suppressor required an extensive background check, registration with federal authorities, approval from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, and payment of a special tax. The process often took months. Supporters of strict regulation argued suppressors could make crimes harder to detect. Opponents countered that they are rarely used in violent crime and are commonly owned for lawful purposes like sport shooting and hunting. The court's ruling examined whether treating suppressors as uniquely restricted items aligns with historical firearm regulation traditions. In this decision, the divide between the majority and the dissent reflects a broader philosophical split on how the Second Amendment should be interpreted. The six-justice majority concluded that suppressors fall within the constitutional protection of the right to keep and bear arms when they are commonly owned for lawful purposes. Their reasoning centered on the idea that the Second Amendment is not limited strictly to the core firearm itself, but can extend to components and accessories that are typically used in connection with lawful gun ownership. Applying the historical test established in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin, the majority found insufficient evidence that early American governments imposed comparable blanket bans or uniquely harsh restrictions on similar devices. Without a clear historical analog, they argued, modern regulations that effectively treat suppressors as prohibited items cannot stand. The majority also emphasized that constitutional rights are not subject to modern policy balancing. In their view, courts are not supposed to weigh perceived public safety benefits against individual rights. Instead, they must determine whether the regulation fits within the historical tradition of firearm regulation. The three dissenting justices took a sharply different approach. They warned that the majority's reading stretches the Second Amendment beyond its original meaning and undermines Congress's authority to address evolving public safety concerns. The dissent argued that suppressors can reduce the audible warning of gunfire, potentially complicating law enforcement response and increasing risks in criminal situations. They also contended that historical silence on suppressors may reflect the technology's limited existence at the founding, not an implicit constitutional protection. In their view, lawmakers should retain flexibility to regulate modern firearm accessories in the interest of public safety. The immediate practical effects of this ruling could be significant, both for individual gun owners and for the broader firearms market. If federal restrictions that treated suppressors as highly controlled items are struck down or substantially narrowed, the purchasing process would likely become faster, less expensive, and more accessible. For decades, acquiring a suppressor required compliance with the strict framework established under the National Firearms Act, including registration, federal approval, fingerprinting, a detailed background check, and payment of a special tax. That process often took many months. If those requirements are invalidated or reduced, consumers could see procedures more closely resemble standard firearm purchases, depending on how lower courts and regulators interpret the ruling. The decision may also trigger legal challenges at the state level. Some states currently prohibit suppressor possession outright, while others allow ownership but mirror federal restrictions. Those state laws could now face constitutional scrutiny under the same historical test applied by the Supreme Court. Law enforcement agencies would likely need to revise policies, training protocols, and enforcement guidelines to align with the new legal standard. From an economic standpoint, manufacturers and retailers could see rapid growth in demand. The suppressor market, once limited by regulatory hurdles, may expand considerably if access increases. At the same time, gun safety advocates warn that wider availability could complicate investigations or reduce the audible cues associated with gunfire. As a result, policymakers across the country may begin exploring alternative regulatory approaches that they believe comply with the court's constitutional framework while addressing public safety concerns. Beyond the immediate issue of suppressors, this ruling carries broader legal and political consequences that could shape the future of firearm regulation in the United States. By reinforcing the history and tradition test first articulated in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin, the court has signaled that long-standing federal or state gun laws are not immune from constitutional scrutiny simply because they have existed for decades. The key question is no longer whether a law promotes public safety in a modern sense, but whether a comparable regulation existed during the nation's early history. That shift places a heavy burden on lawmakers defending contemporary restrictions. As a result, this decision could encourage new legal challenges to other firearm regulations. Policies involving magazine capacity limits, certain semi-automatic firearm bans, licensing systems, and restrictions on specific accessories may now be tested under the same framework. Litigants are likely to argue that if suppressors cannot be heavily restricted without historical precedent, then similar logic should apply to other commonly owned firearm components. Politically, the ruling deepens an already sharp national divide over gun policy. Supporters view the decision as a restoration of constitutional protections and a reaffirmation that rights cannot be narrowed by modern legislative preferences. Opponents see it as limiting the flexibility of elected officials to respond to evolving technology and public safety concerns. In Congress and state legislatures, debates may intensify over how to draft firearm regulations that can survive constitutional review under the court's demanding historical standard. In that sense, the ruling is not just about suppressors. It is another defining step in an ongoing transformation of Second Amendment law. We'll continue to follow this story as lower courts and policymakers react. If you want clear, fact-based updates on this and other major legal developments, hit subscribe and turn on alerts.